The battle for Aleppo intensifies. The United States slaps sanctions on a Chinese firm for allegedly aiding the DPRK's nuclear program. Tension mounts between India and Pakistan, and what to make of the US presidential race after that first debate. Big stories, and we'll tackle them all. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. On most days, we go in-depth on a single story, but once in a month, we like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us from Geneva is CCTV correspondent Liu Xian. With us here in Washington is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. Author and commentator Farhana Kazi joins us from Islamabad, and CCTV correspondent Liling Tan is with us from New York. Let's go to New York and Liling Tan and talk about Syria. Liling, Russia and the United States brokered a ceasefire which fell apart very quickly. We talked with the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, and asked him about that and said, what happens next? And he said, basically, he told me, there is no plan B. We have to rescue this deal. We have to salvage this ceasefire deal. What is the situation right now?
Well, the situation, Anand, is deteriorating. It's getting worse. In fact, it might be at one of the worst points in this conflict so far, given the kind of progress that we had seen a little bit of has now been erased completely for the most part. Now, in Aleppo, fighting is intensifying, and at the Security Council, we have a deadlock. In Aleppo, Syrian government forces, as you may have read, aided by Russian warplanes and Iranian ground support, is laying siege on Aleppo, trying to take back the territory from rebels. And we're hearing reports from UN officials and human rights agencies about the use of bunker buster bombs that are essentially burying women and children under rubble. They're using incendiary bombs, what's commonly known as fire bombs, and they're also targeting hospitals and first responders in what's known as a double tap assault. So basically they strike a target, paramedics come in, and then that's when the second strike occurs. So a lot of the injured civilians are now less likely to get the emergency medical assistance that they need. Now, the Security Council is, of course, infuriated by the latest developments, but unable to agree on what to do. In the past 2 weeks, we've seen infighting within the Council, with Syria and Russia accusing the US, its allies, and Syrian rebels of fueling the conflict and for having ruptured that ceasefire that had been in place for a week, a ceasefire that was brokered by the US and Russia. And in turn, we have the US, its allies, and Syrian rebels accusing Russia and Syria of that aid convoy attack on Monday, on September 19th, that effectively unraveled the ceasefire, but also accusing Russia of hypocrisy, saying that it's bombing Aleppo on one hand, while it is trying to push for a ceasefire here at the Security Council. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of vitriol here at the Security Council. Staffan de Mistura has said that a military solution is not a solution, but time and again we're seeing diplomacy here failing Syria.
All right, let's look at that military solution is not a solution. Simon, that interview that we had with Staffan de Mistura, this is what he had to say about the chances for peace. Let's watch.
None of the countries who have an influence or who are sponsoring or supporting one side or the other even dream that there is a possibility of a military solution. They may be wanting to be in a better position at the time of the negotiation, but no solution on a military nature. That is an important point, which means that regardless of what we are seeing, at the end of the day, there will be a need of a serious discussion.
Yet Bashar al-Assad thinks there is a military solution. He is saying that he will unleash his military to reclaim every last inch of land that he's lost.
Yes, and that, at the end of the day, may well be true. At the end of the day, maybe there will be a political negotiation. But this is clearly not the end of the day. It's not the end of the day from Bashar al-Assad's perspective. It's certainly not the end of the day from President Vladimir Putin's perspective. And I think the events that we've witnessed, particularly over the last week, have underscored not just the relative powerlessness of the United States in this situation, situation to effect any real and meaningful ceasefire. But they have also really damaged Secretary of State John Kerry. He was told, he was warned by people within the Obama administration, other people who sit around the cabinet table with him, Defense Secretary Ashton Carter among them, that trying to hammer a ceasefire plan out with the Russians, putting your faith in the Russians, was a mistaken tactic and it was going to blow up in your face. And Secretary of State John Kerry said, no, this is the only game in town. This is what we have to do. We have to try and pursue this. It has blown up in his face, and it's blown up in his face very badly, where he's calling Moscow and saying to Sergei Lavrov, if you don't put pressure on the Syrians to stop this kind of bombing, I'm walking away from the discussions with you. And the Russians are going, well, okay, fine, so walk away. I mean, there's no threat there that the United States any longer has.
He'd be walking away from his own deal.
Yes, he'd be walking away from his own deal, and also he's relying on the Russians to say, oh yes, this loss of civilian life is absolutely terrible, we must, yeah, we totally understand that and we'll come to the table. Moscow's not going to do that.
Well, let's bring in Liu Xun. She is in Geneva. And Liu Xun, to what extent is this something of a proxy war between the United States and Russia that we are seeing in Syria right now, a fight for influence in this country?
Yeah. Well, I'd first like to address what we just heard just seconds ago. I don't think the Russians or anybody would like to see innocent life lost. We are talking about a bloody war here, it's life and death, so there will be casualties, and some of these casualties can and should be avoided. This is, I think, the consensus of everybody who has a heart around here. I was at the press conference where Kerry and his Russian counterpart Lavrov was announcing this deal. And I tell you, the biggest question everybody had on their mind that particular night is whether or not the goodwill of these two people, of these two persons, can translate into real trust between these two nations, between these two partners, so that they can really work together to solve the Syria issue. And it turned out that I think they were too optimistic, as we just heard. Kerry was not given the support to push forward what he announced that evening, and the angry exchange of words that happened after the mistake shooting down of the mistake killing of some Syrian troops on the ground also show the very bitter relationship between these two countries. And when you have such a lack of trust, it is really difficult. And when you are constantly accusing the other of being the bad guy, you cannot work together. So I don't think this is the right atmosphere at all for Russia and the United States to work together and help solve this problem. And then the United States is also, and Russia probably, do not have enough clout to influence the situation on the ground, whether they like it or not. So that is why this war is so difficult to bring to an end. And then we're talking about all kinds of military financial assistance pumping in to the both sides of this opposition. This is not going to end because the whole world's resources is behind the warring parties.
Let's go to Farana. And Farana, we've seen the ceasefire deal descend very quickly into a pretty fierce argument between Russia and the United States right now on the role that Russia is playing in Syria. Can there be peace in Syria if these two sides of Moscow and Washington are at loggerheads with each other?
Well, there's an argument to be made that Russia is an important player in this crisis, and of course Russia is the alliance with Syria is its only partner in the Middle East. But I think this is beyond Russia. I mean, we also need to secure peace with President Bashar al-Assad. The human rights violations that he has created against his own people in the country, he needs to be held accountable by the international community, by the international courts. And so Russia alone cannot, the peace agreement between the United States and Russia alone is not going to de-escalate the tensions and the violence in the region. There are other international allies and partners that need to be engaged, Iran, for example, and Iraq, and other Middle Eastern Sunni Arab allies that also have a stake in this. And so you have to involve many international players in order to secure or to make the peace deal with Russia meaningful.
Okay, let's move on to our next subject. And these are the allegations made by the United States that a Chinese company has been helping the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with its nuclear program. Let's go to Liu Xun for this. So the US decides to sanction a Chinese company for helping the DPRK's nuclear program. It charges 4 Chinese individuals. How is this being received in China?
Well, I think the way how I see it is that, of course, it is the U.S. decision to sanction individuals or companies as they wish. But on the other hand, do they have independently verifiable evidence that these companies and these individuals have really breached the sanctions that are in place? Do you have the evidences that they have done that? And have you cooperated? Have you signaled to your Chinese counterpart and that you have these suspicions, you have these evidence, and you wish that something can be done about that? What are the official channels of communication that should be followed in this case? As we have seen from Chinese official responses, this is indeed a legal outreach, and the Chinese investigative and jurisdiction authorities have the capacity and will do what they should and what they can to bring any criminals accountable and go after them, but not, accepting being pointed finger at just by being accused that some Chinese company or individuals have done something wrong, and that probably with the acknowledge or the acceptance of the Chinese government either.
Right, it does raise issues of jurisdiction. Simon, let's listen to what the Chinese ambassador to the United States had to say about these U.S. allegations.
The company is a private company in China, and the individuals concerned are Chinese citizens. So they should be under the jurisdiction of Chinese law enforcement agencies. And Chinese law enforcement agencies are doing investigations of their activities. And we will handle this case in accordance with Chinese laws and in accordance with our commitment to UN Security Council resolutions.
Does the ambassador have a point here that this is a Chinese legal issue? Is the United States unilaterally extending its jurisdiction to China?
Well, so there's a couple of different issues here to unpack. First of all, jurisdictional issues don't just apply in this particular case. Look at what the United States is doing, for example, with respect to FIFA and the allegations surrounding corruption within FIFA. Many of the people targeted by the US say, well, we're not American citizens. Why are you coming after us? To which the United States argues jurisdiction from the US applies if, for example, US financial organizations and institutions have in any way touched the allegations that are being made. So the US will defend its jurisdictional provenance on these issues in a variety of different ways, and hear criticism like that from countries now, including China. But essentially what's taking place here is a judicial expression of diplomatic frustration on the part of the United States. The US will argue, well, the Justice Department is completely independent of politics and makes these decisions solely based on an interpretation of the law. What the United States diplomatically wants to see China do is put more pressure on North Korea to alter its behavior with regard to its nuclear aspirations. And it's impossible to imagine that these charges are being brought in some kind of a vacuum, absent the desire of the United States to see more of that pressure being applied.
Right, Liling, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang told President Obama at the UN General Assembly just last week that Beijing supports closer cooperation in the UN Security Council and in enforcement efforts to halt North Korea's nuclear program. How is the United States and China working together to halt the nuclear program?
Well, here at the United Nations, China and the U.S., as well as other Security Council members, are trying to negotiate right now a new UN resolution that would expand sanctions on the DPRK. And this, of course, is a response to the DPRK's most recent nuclear test that has been described by most accounts as having been its biggest and baddest. So now we know China, for the longest time, has always maintained that sanctions need to be balanced with dialogue, but it has increasingly become impatient and frustrated over Pyongyang's repeated nuclear provocations. And as Simon mentioned, it is under growing pressure from the U.S. as well to do more to curb Pyongyang as Pyongyang's strongest ally, to curb the country's nuclear ambitions. So right now, these discussions are ongoing. There is expectation that the Security Council resolution would be adopted when it's ready. But compared to U.S. sanctions, for example, where there's a little bit of gray area, UN Security Council sanctions carry a bit more weight, maybe more restrictive because they're more universal, they fall fall under international law and also because China is a permanent member of the Council itself.
Liu Xun, you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to make a quick comment about what was discussed in the studio. I think whenever the US dollar is involved, that you have a jurisdiction, I think that is a statement that is a bit too much. I mean, US dollars is used in every part of this world. So are you going to say that because US dollars involved, that the US government can go and just, exercise jurisdiction on any parts of the world? I think obviously that's not the case. But I do agree that it is an expression of diplomatic frustration. But I would take it one step further and say that this is diverting the public attention and blame on the stalemate, on the impasse on this DPRK nuclear issue to China, implying basically that Chinese companies and Chinese individuals have been helping the DPRK develop its nuclear weapons so that this crisis will never end. I think that is ultimately the kind of message that is perceived here. And I think that is quite a naive move, because if you really look into the history of the DPRK nuclear crisis, it is not China who started this. It is not China who got the matter worse. It is precisely the United States with its very difficult relationship with the DPRK that have to be worked on here. And there is where the lesson is. In Chinese, we have a saying, if you want to open a knot, it has to be the person who tie the knot. And here it is the United States who should do this, who should take a closer look at their policy.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. When we come back, India claims it carried out surgical strikes into Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. Sparks fly between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump during their first presidential debate. Plus, we'll reflect on the legacy and life of former Israeli leader Shimon Peres, who passed away earlier this week. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to our Journalist Roundtable. Let's get back to our panel. Farhana, tensions have been ramped up this week between India and Pakistan. The Indian military said that it had carried out, quote-unquote, surgical strikes against militant targets in Pakistani-administered Kashmir. Pakistan has denied that these attacks have taken place. But what do we know about this incident?
Well, there's two separate incidents here. First, I can tell you from Islamabad, there's a great deal of frustration and trepidation by the Pakistani military apparatus and civilian leadership that's expressed against what they consider Indian provocation. So there's been Indian attacks against a line of control, which the Pakistanis say that has violated the ceasefire agreement. That's one particular issue of great concern. The second concern is what you raise, which is the so-called surgical strikes, which the Indians have claimed to have killed 20 terrorists. According to the Pakistanis here, there's a lack of evidence, so there's no proof to who's been killed or who's been captured. But the other thing that's really important that hasn't been garnered enough attention is that these two issues deflect attention away from the more important crises and conflict which has been waging in the Kashmir Valley for nearly 70 years. And in light of what happened this summer that began on July the 8th, you had it's almost now 3 months of continued strikes and protests, and thousands of Kashmiris have been jailed. There have been hundreds who've lost their eyesight because of India's use of modern weapons, the pellet guns, and so many in this kind of tensions. The ongoing crisis in Kashmir is really escalated tensions between India and Pakistan.
Okay, Liu Xun, China is trying to calm tensions between Pakistan and India. This is the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang speaking in Beijing. Let's watch.
China is in touch with both India and Pakistan through various channels. China always hopes that India and Pakistan can properly resolve relevant disputes through dialogue and consultation, improve bilateral relations, strengthen all-round cooperation, and jointly promote regional peace, stability, and development.
So what role can China play in resolving this dispute? It's a long-running dispute, as Farhana just pointed out. It's been going on for 70 years.
Well, I think, as you said, it is very important for China to both develop a friendly relationship with India and with Pakistan and make sure that the relationship between India and Pakistan stay on a friendly term. China will use, as it always uses, diplomacy, cooperation, economic development opportunity, win-win proposals to help by helping all sides develop economically and cooperate together. only when you give people economic development, you give people job stability, and you talk to people, you engage in constructive dialogue, that you can do that. And I think that is China's advantage here, because this is China's consistent foreign policy to always try to go for dialogue and never using any speculation or favoring one part to another. I think China has a tremendous role to play. It's just how we, continue to dialogue with the different parts and help calm situations down.
And Lily, what role is there for the United Nations? In fact, the Pakistani ambassador to the United Nations, Maliha Lodi, he asked the Security Council on Thursday to informally brief the body on the escalating tensions with India. What can the UN do?
Yes, that's right. Pakistan has made that request to the Security Council, and I understand the Security Council is also briefing the Secretary General about this request this session on Friday. Now, this, however, isn't the first time that Pakistan has approached the UN to discuss or raise this issue at the Security Council. It has been brought up before, and Ban Ki-moon has asked Pakistan to resolve the differences with India through bilateral dialogue, and that has always been quite the emphasis whenever differences between nations, when nations bring their differences to the UN. Now, the thing, though, is that the UN will in all likelihood not intervene and not mediate unless both countries bring the request. That is, if India and Pakistan both make the request of the UN to mediate. And as of now, I understand it's only Pakistan. So what's likely to come out of the UN is more of an urging for Pakistan and India to resolve this bilaterally.
Okay, and this is where we say goodbye to our correspondent in Geneva, Liu Xin. Thanks very much for being with us. Let's move on to the US election with the rest of our panel. And Simon, the first debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump has taken place. Let's watch.
And look at her website. You know what? It's no different than this. She's telling us how to fight ISIS. Just go to her website. She tells you how to fight ISIS on her website. I don't think General Douglas MacArthur would like that too much.
The next segment, we're continuing the subject.
Well, at least I have a plan to fight ISIS.
No, you're telling the enemy everything you want to do.
No, we're not.
See, you're telling the enemy everything you want to do. No wonder you've been fighting. No wonder you've been fighting ISIS your entire adult life.
Folks, go to the fact checkers. Get to work.
What did you make of it, Simon?
Well, I was there, I mean, not in the room, but right outside it, observing the circus surrounding it. And, first of all, we're in the midst of total insanity here. Secondly, we are in the midst of a circus. And that wasn't even the worst of it, right? That wasn't even the most immature area of it. Look, clearly, Donald Trump, I think, had a very good 20 minutes at the start. He was very strong, hitting Hillary Clinton over free trade and her shifting positions on issues including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the proposed free trade deal with the Asia-Pacific region. But then everything started falling apart for him. He was evidently unprepared, woefully unprepared, and she was evidently overly prepared. I mean, she was ready with those zingers that will be remembered from this debate, the one about stamina, and, she's prepared for the presidency as well as preparing for the debate. And his constant interruptions, his demeanor, her unleashing of that landmine that the campaign had very, very carefully buried concerning the former Miss Universe pageant winner who accuses Donald Trump of misogyny, an issue that continues to play out even today through the rest of the week, fueled largely by Donald Trump himself, undercuts one claim that he made in that debate, which is that he has the temperament for the presidency. He's got a winning temperament, and he's got a temperament that's in control. He clearly doesn't have a temperament that's in control, and how they are now going to prepare him better for the subsequent two debates that are going to take place is a huge issue for the campaign, but a huge issue for all of us is how all this plays publicly. Conventional wisdom says, you look at that debate, Hillary Clinton won it, it's going to really damage him, and she's going to have a substantial bounce in the opinion polls. We're not actually seeing that. His support seems to be very solid, and in some of the battleground states where the election will be won or lost ultimately, even appears to be growing. And that has still got to be very, very confounding to the Clinton campaign.
Lilling, both these candidates met with several world leaders during the recent UN General Assembly meetings in New York. Any sense of what they make of either a Hillary Clinton presidency or Donald Trump in the White House?
Yes, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump did meet with some world leaders during the high-level UN General Assembly week, and there was a lot of scrutiny over how they conducted themselves. Now, we know Clinton met with Ukraine's Petro Poroshenko, with Japan's Shinzo Abe, and also with Egypt's Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And for her, many observers said this was a chance for her to strut her diplomatic stuff and to build on existing relationships. She is, after all, a known personality in the international community. Now, for Donald Trump, who met with Egypt's el-Sisi, it was a chance for him to kind of test drive a possible presidency as well. And that was how it was seen. But we've also seen some missteps from Trump. Apparently, reportedly, he rebuffed a meeting with Poroshenko. And of course, last month, his meeting in Mexico received quite mixed reviews.
And Farhana, what's the view from South Asia? Did people follow this first debate very closely?
Yeah, well, I think I want to speak now as an American Muslim woman, and I want to say that I don't believe that neither presidential candidate, Trump or Mrs. Clinton, has a plan to defeat ISIS. But one thing I can say from speaking as a Muslim woman and obviously now being in the Muslim world here, that people are leaning towards Mrs. Clinton, even though she's seen as soft on power and that she will continue the current policies and practices of President Barack Obama, and so there will be continued military strikes, for example. But the one thing that is to her benefit is that she has this policy of inclusion. So Muslim countries and even American Muslim communities actually lean towards her because she's seen as being fair, as a balanced approach, and that she has a policy of inclusion, whereas Trump clearly has this policy of exclusion. And quite frankly, he worries the Muslim nations and the people that I've spoken to.
Okay, let's move on to our last segment. It's a segment where we normally ask our guests for the next big story, but today we're going to talk about the life and legacy of Shimon Peres, the Israeli leader who died this week. And let's go around the table with this, and I'd be grateful if you could keep this short, Lily.
Yes, I believe that even though the international community will remember Shimon Peres as someone who had, for his role in negotiating the Oslo Peace Accords, for the Nobel Peace Prize, and for being a proponent of the two-state solution, remember that he was also a very controversial figure at home, precisely in Israel, precisely because of the Oslo Accords, and also among Arab nations, among some Arab nations over the Arab-Israeli conflict. So depending on who you ask, he is perceived as either a peacemaker or a war maker.
Right, opinions are varied. It depends on who you ask, as you point out. Farhana?
Yeah, well, I think he surely will be missed. This is a person who was a symbol of peace, as was rightly noted. He was a visionary. When I look at the Facebook page of Shimon Peres, you have many Jews who are speaking for him and saying that, Israel needs another Shimon Peres. You need someone who's able to build coalition and forge alliances rather than in order to construct a viable peace initiative, as he did in the region. And so I think that hopefully that now that Peres is, that now he's no longer with us, that there can be some lessons learned and people can look back at his policies.
Son.
Palestinians will not necessarily accept this characterization, but certainly in the latter portion of his life, he was a man of common decency. He was a statesman. And there aren't many of those around these days. And in that regard, the idea that you can sit down and have a rational, normal conversation, especially after what we just talked about, the US presidential election, in that regard, he'll really be missed.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.